Basically, GRDC have employed through MVT, Nick and myself, to be an independent person to speak on the varieties performance through the MVT trials and present it at grower updates. So to save me some travel, Nick is doing the wetter environments, the high rainfall environments, north central, northeast and southwest, and I'm doing the Wimmera and Mallee. So this session is principally focused on those two areas that we're going to talk about. I think as Rob Norton said in his past talk, that it's very good to review the season that occurred, and particularly in the Mallee and the Wimmera, there were quite extreme differences between them. The Mallee, which was consistent with the Wimmera, had a very dry summer, so we did have in the region no soil moisture and a lot of plant back from herbicide issues. That coupled with a relatively late break, late May, and the majority of paddocks were subsequently dry sown, which meant we had a lot of volunteer wheat, volunteer barley coming through both the barley and wheat crops that preceded them. The growing season rainfall was also below average, and the timing of the rainfall was also quite critical this year, particularly when looking at the variety performances, in that August was particularly dry and so was early September, and varieties that maybe didn't benefit from that 15th of September rainfall were really jeopardised by their performance in many trials. We also had a lot of smaller rainfall events, like 3 to 5 mil rainfall events, followed with a pretty extreme wind. I don't know, I've tried to go through BOM data and try and find some supporting evidence on that, but I think categorically everyone was commenting on how windy this or last year was. So the benefit of those smaller rainfall events is also up for question because the wind subsequently dried it out very, very quickly. And there was also the frost event. It wasn't as pronounced in the Mallee as it was in the Wimmera, but that certainly would have affected some variety. But as James Hunt said, you would have had to sow in probably July to avoid those frosts in many cases. Stubble-borne diseases were very common. Yellow leaf spot, spot forming nip blotch were there, but not many cases or instances of rust came about. Heading in the Wimmera, dry summer, that's pretty common, but normal to late break in the schemes of things, and many of the paddocks were also sown dry, particularly barley, and they had volunteer wheat in them. Very, very good average to above average growing season rainfall, and very little disease problems in terms of rust. Grant said that, and nitrogen was definitely the key in the Wimmera. And there was certainly this frost in localised areas on the 18th of August. Just to summarise the season a little bit, just did the means of the barley yield versus, or just compared site means of barley versus wheat. And historically we'd always probably expect barley to yield a little bit better than wheat, and you can see it was probably more evident in the Wimmera areas than it was in the Mallee, but probably only about 0.1 to 0.2 higher in the Mallee for barley, but gives you a bit of a snapshot of the results are pretty consistent with previous years. This is a trial at Menangatang, just took a photo, it looked really good when I was there, and sunlight coming through, so I kept that photo there, and you can just see that we often really don't visit the MVT sites and you don't see photos, but you know, you can clearly see here it's a pretty good established trial, well nutrition and everything like that. So, but instead of going through specific trials, I'll actually try and summarise it up so we get a good idea, because the varieties are really standing up quite well across regions. And you can see from the Mallee perspective here that Korak, Emu Rock and Mace have performed really well in 2013. Harper, which is an intergrain line, APW, and it used to be IGB 3160, I think, if Ashley, is that correct? 3170, sorry. So that's been released, and that's done pretty well in the Mallee environment in the last couple of years. Trojans thereabouts, probably better Wimmera wheat perspective per se, but the two up the top have been Korak and Mace for my liking. Emu Rock's certainly been consistent there as well, but you'll see later on Mace and Korak are going really well. The most interesting thing in terms of the clear fields has been cord versus grenade. A lot of people took up cord last year because of the herbicide plant backs. Subsequently, biggest problem with cord is probably susceptibility to sprouting, and of which people were leaning towards grenade to replace it with, but in the absence of that, we probably, if anything, are seeing cord yield slightly better than grenade in a couple of trials in the Mallee, particularly from farmers' experiences as well. Sorry, I shouldn't have flicked that. It'd be interesting in question time to get Colin to sort of comment on maybe why Scout hasn't performed very well, maybe over the last 2 years. I don't really know what it is, but it just, in paddocks as well, it just hasn't done as well as it had 2 years ago, where it really stood out as a classic variety that we were quite excited about. But for some reason, Scout and Phantom haven't had very good years, particularly last year in the Mallee. Yippee is thereabouts, certainly as a mainstay variety, and people are still very happy with that. If I just go to the long-term performance data, and this is not the 2013 included data, but I still like the fact that it's matching up well with how I predict, I guess, the varieties. And you can see that Scout, over long-term performance estimate, that would be up top, but also Korak and Mace are very solid varieties. When I'm heading down to the Wimmera now, we're sort of thinking about, okay, well, would we be seeing a high rainfall? We'll see some of those longer season, greater choice of varieties coming out, and maybe some of those susceptibility to diseases be more evident in these areas. But clearly you can see that Mace and Korak are still performing well in those wetter environments, which is a really good thing to choose. It's been well adapted to those environments. Cobra had a fantastic year. Trojan really performed well and is suited to probably the Wimmera to the northeast, north central areas, but in the Mallee probably tends to slip down a little bit, but it also is a very good variety there. APW, there's APW for Korak and Trojan, which is important, versus Mace, which is hard. If they're all going to yield the same, there may be the profitability over longer term, better off growing Mace in that case, but for diversification and not having to spray every paddock for stripe rust, maybe Korak and Trojan might be better varieties. Looking at the long-term performance data in Horsham now, I presented this last year where I actually had Axe as being a very high-yielding variety in Horsham, but this has subsequently been updated, and you can see that Mace and Korak are up the top there, and also Scout. So the message is still the same, that those varieties are really standing up as good varieties for us to adopt. And I just did this morning thinking about, if we look at 2 different seasons, how consistent is a variety to performing above the site mean, and the yields are expressed in that manner. But you can see that Korak and Mace are pretty consistent in the Mallee, the first 2 bars, and in the Wimmera in terms of having significant yield advantages over the majority of other varieties in the trials. Whereas you can see Scout, Derrimut, down this end, Emirock and Harper, they'll up and down certain regions and certain seasons. But from a variety point of view, I'd much rather be growing these 2 varieties because they're consistent over the seasons. Heading into the barley now, BCG also do trials through the GRDC Barley Agronomy project, which I'll also present some data on, but doing this exact same thing with the performance of the trials from the MVT in the Mallee environment. You can clearly see that these 2 varieties have come of interest above high marsh. Every other year I sort of presented some data, and high marsh tended to always be superior to all other varieties, but we're starting to see some real genuine competitors to high marsh in the system now. And Skipper was certainly one of interest last year, and it probably hasn't yielded as well as Fathom this year, but Compass is a very new, exciting potential malt variety that we should all be getting excited about, because its yield advantage in all environments, Mallee and Wimmera, seems to be fantastic. So it's got very, very good disease package. If anything, it's maybe head loss might be a bit iffy, but it's got very good consistency across states. The rest of the varieties down here, if anyone's still growing Gardner, you've really got to question why you're growing Gardner, and ask your clients why they are, because I haven't seen a variety trial where Gardner's really improved the yields, or you're probably sacrificing probably 10 to 20% yield in most cases if you're growing Gardner still. And with the advantages of malt now, I think there's a few malt varieties by far better. But heading into the Wimmera, what do you probably find? You're seeing Compass now stand up as a very, very good variety, and it's going 20% better than the site mean. So that, for me, is suggesting that Compass is looking like a very well adapted variety. It's very similar to a Commander sort of family, so pretty much would manage exactly the same way as Commander. Probably doesn't have the yield penalty drop off when it comes to a lower rainfall area, which we saw in the Mallee. But the fact that we're seeing a very, very good trend of a mean of sites, which is probably, I think, 4 sites in the Wimmera, but it's actually going very, very well. Fathom is a barley variety bred out of the University of Adelaide. It's been bred it's been incorporated with a wild barley, so it's supposed to give it improved drought tolerance as well as improved water use efficiency. I think it's got a really good fit in the mallee for on sandhills, where we might find establishment of high marshes a bit poor, but it certainly has the yield advantages too for all other areas. It's got CCN and resistance to spot form and net blotch, so which were two big things I think for the mallee to think about when they had scope growing last year. So I'll be certainly more leaning towards fathom in a mallee environment. Regional comparison over the 2 years, again, you can see that Compass is performing very well across the mallee, North Central and Wimmera. Basically the consistency and the gap differences between them are quite minor, therefore it's well adapted to 3 environments as far as my interpretation of it. You're seeing a scope pretty consistent as well, but it's back towards the site mean, but we know what scope's role is in the farming system. It's a weed control point of view. Heading into the barley agronomy trials to now talk about possibly better understanding some of these varieties and how they might fit. We did a weed competition trial over at Nil where we've actually hand spread wild, or not wild oats, but milling oats in front of the plots before sowing, and then we went and sowed over the top with the plot seeder with the different varieties. So on the left you'll see high marsh, and on the right you'll see high marsh with oats. Now oats is a very good competitor, I guess, to simulate ryegrass and wild oat sort of comparisons. So we're getting a pretty good understanding, but the results may differ with, say, a brome grass type population that might germinate late. But high marsh is very renowned for poor weed competition. So this was particularly interesting. So when we actually did the yield loss, measured did a whole lot more assessments than what I'm presenting, but basically this is what we want to know is which varieties lost the most amount of yield and which produced the most amount of seed set of the weeds. And in this case it's the oats, but I've named them as weed. You can see that Wimmera has certainly, including high marsh, certainly had significant yield losses above other varieties, but probably most importantly was that high marsh produced a heap more seed, or weed seeds in this case, going to heading on the ground or going in the sample, equal to the worst variety, Wimmera in this case. So everyone, what they're seeing in the field, that high marsh is a poor competitor, yes, exactly right. The thing that probably alarms me a little bit is that Latrobe has exactly the same plant architecture as high marsh, exactly the same yields, the same. Why are we seeing probably Latrobe have less seeds going through? I don't know. That needs to be repeated to see if this data is consistent, but just the way the high marsh nature is, that's supporting what the evidence is that high marsh is a poor competitor. But to get more excited about Compass, you can just see that Scope and Bull Oak, same family, same types, very consistent there. Compass is showing very good competitiveness against weeds, which is good to see if we're going to incorporate that variety into our farming system. I did have more. Yeah, so that's just some take-home messages. Delaying harvest, people were complaining about head loss in barley varieties, and people were concerned about scope, particularly dropping heads. We did a trial as part of the Barley Agronomy Initiative to look at delayed harvest. So it essentially was a delayed time of sowing trial where we had 2 blocks of early time of sowing, and we harvested the first one at the optimum timing, and then we left the other one for at least 4 weeks, and then a significant rainfall event of, I think, 18 mils or 20 mils actually fell at a particular time, which is on the around that 3rd of December. We actually had nearly 20 mils of rain that fell on these plots. What we're looking at here is that 2010 was obviously an extreme harvest, wet harvest. 2010, 2011 and 9 were also pretty wet harvests, but the last 2 years, 2012 and 13, were pretty dry. So I'm expecting that the results we get from this trial are actually going to match very well with what we would have seen last year as well. In terms of the head loss that we saw, quite large error bars here, but as you can imagine, trying to do head counts or heads that fell on the ground can be variable and nothing to do with the way the trial is managed, but just the variability in the way we sample. You can see here that Skipper and Gardner actually had quite a lot of head loss there, as did Scope. So yes, Scope does have more heads falling off than other varieties, but Fathom, Commander and Compass are sort of down the lot. But Compass, very similar probably to Commander. If you do find Commander in the field, does lose some heads, it's probably going to be in that same area, but Commander certainly can lose some heads on the ground. And the yield loss side of things, you can see that Compass didn't lose as much from delaying harvest, whereas varieties like Gardner and Fathom did. Skipper certainly did as well, and Skipper is very prone to lodging, so that's a variety that you need to really get onto early. But Compass, the fact that it didn't lose much yield is very good, and High Marsh and Latrobe are also very good varieties in that case. So just to summarise what my choice would be in the mallee environment, if most people have got Scout and Mace in the system already, so I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy Korak unless you had a particular need for it, such as establishment on a sandhill. It's APW, so if Mace is going to yield exactly the same as Korak, in that case, I probably don't see a huge advantage just yet. Mace has got that boron tolerance, so it should perform a little bit better on that heavier soil around Birchip. In terms of the Wimmera, there's greater choice. You've got Scout, Mace, Korak or Trojan, if I was selecting any of those. In the barleys, High Marsh, Latrobe's probably got the malt. It's been released, but with it pending malting accreditation, so it's not official yet. So that will be something that, if it goes malt, there's an advantage there to grow over High Marsh. And a lot of people probably don't have much High Marsh or clean High Marsh seed at the moment, which is a bit of a concern. So to go and get some new clean seed would be good. Compass won't be available to 2015, so that's also very promising. So I'm sort of holding off on changing over from High Marsh or Scope just yet, until that variety comes available. Fathom, I'd only grow, particularly in the mallee where I've got sandhills that I really want to try and get some cover on and some greater water use, drought tolerance. In the Wimmera, High Marsh again and Compass would be certainly ones I grow, although I know there's a lot more Commander being grown in the area too. So, but in the future, in 2015, I'll be growing Compass, maintaining Commander for the moment. And I think that's it. So.